The wind over Europe in 1939 carried a sound the world had heard before but prayed it would never hear again. It was not yet the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery, but something quieter, more foreboding, the slow tightening of a noose made not of rope, but of ambition, fear, and unresolved wounds left festering after the last great war. It is here, in this moment of uneasy silence before the storm, that the story of humanity's deadliest conflict begins again, not as a sudden eruption, but as an accumulation of choices, miscalculations, and desperate gambles that would draw nations, armies, and millions of ordinary lives into a struggle that would burn across continents. The world stood on the edge of an abyss, and few realized how quickly it would fall. The seeds of the coming catastrophe had been planted 2 decades earlier, in the muddy fields of the First World War and in the ink of treaties meant to secure peace but instead sowed resentment. Germany, humiliated and economically strangled by the Treaty of Versailles, searched for stability in the ruins, only to find itself drawn toward a leader who promised not just revival but dominance. Adolf Hitler, rising from the fringes of political extremism, tapped into a well of national frustration, reshaping it into a weaponized ideology that fused nationalism, expansionism, and racial supremacy into a singular, relentless vision. By the mid-1930s, the world watched uneasily as he rearmed the nation, defied international agreements, and built a military machine with terrifying speed and precision. Europe, still haunted by the memory of the last war, hesitated. Britain and France, exhausted by the trauma of the trenches, clung to diplomacy, hoping that reason, or at least appeasement, might prevent another catastrophe. The League of Nations, conceived to safeguard peace, proved powerless in the face of aggression. Japan expanded into China with brutal efficiency, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Hitler absorbed territory piece by piece, each step bolder than the last. The world's response was fragmented, uncertain. The machinery of conflict, once set in motion, gathered momentum long before the first shot was fired. By the late summer of 1939, the stage was set. Germany, having already annexed Austria and dismembered Czechoslovakia, now turned its gaze eastward. Poland stood next in Hitler's path, a nation reborn after World War I, determined to defend its sovereignty yet isolated and outmatched. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world, a cynical agreement in which 2 rival powers carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, buying Hitler the time he needed and granting Stalin a buffer zone he believed essential for survival. With this pact secured, the fuse was lit. At dawn on September 1, 1939, the sky over Poland filled with the sound of engines. German aircraft swept across borders with devastating speed, bombing airfields, rail junctions, and cities. Below them, armored divisions surged forward in a coordinated assault unlike anything Europe had witnessed. Blitzkrieg lightning war combined tanks, mechanized infantry, mobile artillery, and air power into a single, fast-moving spearhead designed to break a nation's defenses before they could properly form. Poland fought with courage, but the pace and scale of the assault were overwhelming. Within weeks, German forces had pierced deep into the heart of the country, while Soviet troops advanced from the east, sealing Poland's fate. News of the invasion shocked the world, and on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The declaration marked the official beginning of World War II, yet for months afterward, the Western Front remained strangely quiet. Troops mobilized, trenches were dug, and fortifications reinforced, but neither side initiated the massive confrontations many expected. This period became known as the Phony War, a deceptive calm before a storm far greater than the one that had engulfed Poland. Britain and France hoped their defensive posture, anchored by the Maginot Line, would force Germany into a stalemate. Hitler, meanwhile, prepared something entirely different. As winter gave way to spring in 1940, Germany struck again, this time targeting Denmark and Norway in a rapid campaign aimed at securing iron ore shipments and controlling vital naval routes. The invasions were swift and precise, showcasing the tactical agility of the Wehrmacht and revealing deep vulnerabilities in Allied planning and coordination. Norway's rugged terrain and fierce resistance slowed the German advance but ultimately could not stop it. Denmark fell within hours, a stark lesson in the new realities of modern warfare. Speed, surprise, and mobility now outweighed sheer numbers. While the Allies reeled from these early blows, Hitler turned his attention to Western Europe. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched a massive offensive through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, a move expected by the Allies but still devastating due to Germany's radical approach. Instead of attempting to smash head-on into the heavily fortified French border, the Wehrmacht moved through the Ardennes, a region the French believed impassable for armored units. The gamble paid off. German tank columns advanced with astonishing speed, bypassing the main defensive lines and sweeping toward the English Channel, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied troops in a pocket around Dunkirk. The fall of France, long considered one of the world's great military powers, now seemed imminent. But amidst the collapse came a moment of extraordinary human resilience. In late May 1940, as German forces closed in on Dunkirk, a massive evacuation began. Naval vessels, warships, transports, fishing boats, ferries, and privately owned craft crossed the channel under constant threat from air attacks, rescuing more than 300,000 British and French soldiers. It was a triumph born of desperation, a testament to what ordinary people could accomplish in extraordinary circumstances. Yet it also marked the end of France's hopes. By June, Paris was occupied, and the French government capitulated soon after. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe, facing the might of a continent under Nazi control. Hitler expected the British to seek terms, but Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, vowed to fight on. Britain's survival depended not only on political will, but on control of the skies. And so began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. German bombers and fighters launched wave after wave of attacks against airfields, radar installations, ports, and later cities, attempting to destroy the Royal Air Force and force Britain to its knees. Yet radar, strategic defense, and the skill of RAF pilots, many barely out of adolescence, held the line. In the late summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its attacks towards civilian targets, unleashing the Blitz upon London, Coventry, Birmingham, and other cities. Thousands of civilians were killed, yet the British spirit did not break. Far from Europe, the conflict's global dimensions were taking shape. Japan, already locked in a brutal war in China, saw opportunity in the unfolding chaos. Its ambitions stretched across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, driven by a hunger for resources and a belief in its own imperial destiny. Tensions with the United States grew as America sought to restrain Japanese expansion through embargoes and diplomatic pressure. The world was drifting toward an even larger, more complex conflict, one that would soon engulf oceans and continents far beyond Europe's borders. Yet the most decisive shift was forming quietly, deep inside Hitler's strategic imagination. For all his victories in the West, the Nazi dictator believed his true destiny lay in the East. The Soviet Union, vast and resource-rich, represented both ideological hatred and strategic opportunity. Despite the non-aggression pact, Hitler viewed Stalin's regime as his ultimate enemy. Throughout 1940 and into early 1941, he planned an invasion unlike any in history, a campaign he believed would destroy Soviet power in a matter of months. The world, still absorbing the shock of France's collapse and Britain's resilience, had little idea that the largest land invasion in human history was approaching. And as German forces prepared for a campaign stretching thousands of miles, another turning point loomed across the Atlantic, where the United States, officially neutral but increasingly entangled, inched closer to the conflict that would define a generation. Here, amid shifting alliances and escalating ambitions, the war prepared to burst open on a scale the world had never seen, drawing nations and peoples into a crucible from which none would emerge unchanged. Across Europe, the summer of 1941 arrived with a deceptive warmth, masking the cold calculations unfolding inside the German high command. The planning for Operation Barbarossa had begun months earlier, driven by Hitler's conviction that the Soviet Union, despite its size, despite its millions of soldiers, despite its harsh terrain, would collapse swiftly under the weight of German military power. The Wehrmacht, emboldened by its victories in the West, prepared for what it believed would be the decisive campaign of the war. Generals envisioned sweeping advances, encirclements measured not in towns but in entire armies, and the conquest of vast territories before winter's approach. Yet beneath this confidence lay flawed assumptions, a profound underestimation of Soviet resilience, industrial capacity, and the staggering challenges posed by geography. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the eastern horizon erupted with gunfire, artillery barrages, and the roar of engines as more than 3 million Axis troops surged across an 1,800-mile front. The scale was unprecedented, a tidal wave of men and machines sweeping into Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. The initial shock was devastating. Soviet defenses buckled, forward airfields were obliterated, thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Entire Soviet divisions found themselves encircled, cut off, or shattered before they could mount an organized response. Operation Barbarossa unfolded with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned officers. Towns fell in rapid succession, and German armored spearheads advanced dozens of miles each day. But beneath the appearance of swift triumph lay deeper complexities. The Soviet Union, though initially disoriented, possessed reserves vast enough to replace losses that would cripple any other nation. Factories east of the Ural Mountains began working around the clock, producing tanks, artillery, and munitions at astonishing rates. Civilians, many of them women and teenagers, joined the labor force in numbers previously unimaginable. Trains streamed eastward, carrying entire industrial plants dismantled piece by piece, preserving the Soviet war machine beyond the reach of German bombs. What Hitler had expected to be a short campaign instead awakened a colossal, determined adversary. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, it encountered not only fierce resistance but terrain that defied quick victory. Roads turned to mud after summer rains, rivers wide and swift slowed advances. Supplies struggled to keep pace with fast-moving armor, leaving frontline troops short of food, ammunition, and fuel. German logistics, designed for wars of limited distance, strained under the enormity of the Eastern Front. Yet despite these challenges, German forces captured vast swaths of land, encircling entire armies near Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Prisoners by the hundreds of thousands marched westward, victims of a brutal occupation strategy shaped by ideology as much as military necessity. For civilians, the invasion brought unimaginable suffering. Entire villages were emptied or burned. Populations already weakened by political purges, famine, and repression now faced starvation, disease, and violence on a scale that defied comprehension. Nazi racial policies fueled atrocities across the occupied territories. Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units followed in the wake of advancing troops, conducting mass shootings that targeted Jewish communities, political officials, and perceived enemies of the Reich. These early acts of systematic murder marked the grim escalation toward genocide, foreshadowing horrors yet to come. By late summer, the German advance approached the gates of Leningrad and the suburbs of Moscow. Hitler, believing victory was within reach, diverted forces southward to capture the agricultural and industrial riches of Ukraine, including the vital city of Kharkov and the coal-rich Donbas region. The decision stretched German lines even thinner, further complicating supply routes already strained by distance and hostile resistance. Meanwhile, the Soviet command reorganized its shattered forces, moved reserves into critical positions, and called upon its citizens to defend their homeland at all costs. The German timetable, built on expectations of a swift collapse, began to slip. Far to the west, another strategic shift was unfolding across the Atlantic. The United States, though still officially neutral, was increasingly drawn into the struggle. President Franklin Roosevelt recognized that Britain could not survive indefinitely without American support. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in early 1941, allowed the U.S. to supply weapons, food, and materials to nations resisting the Axis. Convoys carrying these supplies braved the perilous waters of the North Atlantic, where German U-boats prowled relentlessly. The Battle of the Atlantic escalated into a life-and-death contest between submarines and escort ships, a struggle over the arteries that sustained Britain's ability to fight. American industry, awakening from the constraints of the Great Depression, began to surge. Factories converted to wartime production with astonishing speed. Aircraft assembly lines grew larger than any the world had seen. Steelworks glowed red through the night. Workers, men and women alike, poured into plants that would soon produce tanks, trucks, jeeps, and ships by the tens of thousands. Though still not officially at war, the United States was becoming the arsenal of democracy, reshaping the global balance of power even before committing its own military to the conflict. Back in the east, the German drive toward Moscow intensified as autumn approached. Operation Typhoon, the final push to capture the Soviet capital, launched in October 1941. The plan aimed to encircle and crush Soviet forces defending the city, delivering a decisive blow before winter set in. Initial advances were impressive, trapping multiple Soviet armies and opening the road to Moscow, but heavy rains soon transformed the landscape into a sea of mud. Vehicles bogged down, horses collapsed, soldiers trudged through fields that swallowed equipment whole. The Rasputitsa, Russia's infamous season of mud, brought the German momentum to a halt. When the ground finally froze, allowing armored units to move again, temperatures plunged to levels for which German forces were entirely unprepared. Engines seized in the cold, weapons jammed, frostbite ravaged exposed skin. Soviet troops, outfitted for winter and buoyed by fresh reinforcements from Siberia, counterattacked. The Germans, exhausted and stretched to their limits, were forced into retreat. The myth of German invincibility was shattered on the outskirts of Moscow, and for the first time, the world saw that the Nazi war machine could be stopped. While Germany grappled with setbacks in the east, Japan faced a crisis of its own. American embargoes, particularly on oil, threatened the survival of Japan's military operations in China and its broader imperial ambitions. Japanese leaders believed that war with the United States was becoming unavoidable. Instead of negotiating, they plotted a bold, high-risk strategy, a sudden, crippling strike intended to neutralize American naval power long enough to secure domination in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Plans were drawn, fleets assembled, and a date chosen. The Pacific, until then a theater of simmering tension, was about to erupt. And so the war, already vast and brutal, moved inexorably toward a turning point that would change everything. One morning in December, when the world awoke to an attack that would redraw the map of global conflict and draw the last major power fully into the struggle that would define the fate of nations. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned quietly over Pearl Harbor, the waters calm beneath the rising sun. Sailors on the decks of American battleships went about their routines unaware that hundreds of miles away, a Japanese strike force was heading toward them with engines humming in perfect formation. The attack, meticulously planned and rehearsed, was intended to shock the world, to shatter American naval power in the Pacific before the United States could fully grasp the scale of Japan's ambitions. When the first wave of aircraft appeared over Oahu just before 8 a.m., the illusion of peace shattered in an instant. Bombs and torpedoes rained down upon battleships anchored in neat rows. The USS Arizona exploded in a colossal fireball, its hull torn apart, killing more than 1,000 men in seconds. Columns of smoke rose into the sky as sailors leapt into oil-slicked waters, struggling to rescue their comrades amid the chaos. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact was seismic. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Japan had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted heavy damage, yet crucially, American aircraft carriers, absent from Pearl Harbor that day, remained unharmed. In Tokyo, leaders celebrated what they believed to be a decisive blow that would force the United States to negotiate. Instead, they awakened a giant. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America as well. A regional conflict had become a truly global war, aligning the industrial might of the United States with the embattled forces of Britain and the Soviet Union. Across the Pacific, Japan launched simultaneous offensives that stretched from Burma to the Philippines and deep into the Dutch East Indies. Its soldiers advanced with fierce discipline, capturing Hong Kong, sweeping through Malaya, and driving toward Singapore, the fortress Britain believed impregnable from the sea, but which fell in February 1942 after a relentless Japanese assault from the landward side. The fall of Singapore, with more than 80,000 Allied troops surrendering, marked one of the greatest defeats in British military history. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces fought desperately on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, holding out for months against overwhelming odds before finally succumbing. Those who surrendered faced brutal conditions in the Bataan Death March, a harrowing ordeal that exposed the harsh realities of Japan's wartime conduct. Despite these early triumphs, Japan had underestimated both the industrial power and strategic resolve of the United States. American shipyards began producing vessels at a pace unprecedented in naval history. Factories turned out aircraft that would become icons of the air war: the rugged F-4F Wildcat, the agile F-6F Hellcat, and the versatile B-25 bomber. Military leaders, including Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, developed a long-term strategy to push back across the Pacific, island by island, toward Japan itself. But in the early months of 1942, the Allies remained on the defensive, their resources stretched thin across vast distances. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, the German U-boat campaign reached its deadly peak. With America now in the war, submarine operations extended along the eastern seaboard of the United States. German commanders referred to this period as the Second Happy Time, as merchant ships, silhouetted by coastal city lights, became easy targets. Torpedoes streaked through dark waters, striking tankers and freighters that burned brightly against the night sky. The sea became a graveyard for sailors and civilians alike. But Allied countermeasures soon improved. Radar, sonar, code-breaking, and convoy escorts gradually turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic, ensuring the survival of the shipping lanes vital to Britain's survival and the broader Allied war effort. On the Eastern Front, the brutal struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union entered a new and deadly phase. The winter of 1941-42 had halted the German advance outside Moscow, but spring brought renewed fighting. Hitler, frustrated by the failure to take the Soviet capital, redirected his efforts southward toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, resources he believed essential for sustaining the German war machine. The summer offensive, codenamed Case Blue, began with spectacular advances. German armored divisions swept through the steppe, capturing cities like Voronezh and driving deep into the southern regions of the Soviet Union. But as German forces pushed farther east, their supply lines stretched thinner than ever. Hitler's fixation on symbolic objectives, particularly the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, diverted resources from the broader strategic goal of securing oil. The city, a major industrial center bearing Stalin's name, became a focal point of both propaganda and military planning. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed a devastating bombing campaign, reducing much of Stalingrad to rubble. German infantry moved in soon after, expecting swift victory. Instead, they encountered a hellish urban battlefield unlike any they had faced. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army fought with extraordinary determination. Factories became fortresses, stairwells death traps, and sewers conduits for surprise attacks. Soviet snipers hunted German officers from hidden positions. Supply drops to Soviet defenders, made across the Volga under constant fire, kept the front lines alive. The struggle descended into a grinding war of attrition, its brutality amplified by the shattered landscape that offered no shelter from artillery or the cold winds of approaching winter. While the battle raged, Allied leaders met to coordinate their global strategy. The Arcadia Conference in Washington brought Churchill and Roosevelt together in the early weeks of American involvement. Out of these meetings emerged the decision that Germany would remain the primary focus of Allied efforts, even as Japan rampaged across the Pacific. This Germany First strategy reflected both the danger posed by Hitler's regime and the recognition that defeating the European Axis was essential for long-term victory. Yet the pressures of the Pacific War demanded immediate action. Early clashes at the Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 tested American carrier aviation in battles fought entirely by aircraft without ships ever coming into visual contact. Midway in particular proved decisive. In June 1942, American codebreakers uncovered Japanese plans to lure U.S. carriers into a trap. Instead, the U.S. Navy ambushed the Japanese fleet northwest of Midway Atoll. In a few critical minutes, American dive bombers crippled 3 of Japan's frontline carriers and later sank a 4th. The battle shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan, though still formidable, lost irreplaceable pilots and ships that would haunt its prospects for the remainder of the war. As the tide slowly began to turn at sea, the Red Army prepared its own turning point on land. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement maneuver targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian units protecting the flanks of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. The attack succeeded beyond expectations. Within days, more than 250,000 Axis troops found themselves trapped in a vast pocket. Hitler ordered them to stand fast, promising that supplies would be flown in. Yet the Luftwaffe, overstretched and battered, could not meet the demands. Hunger, disease, and relentless Soviet pressure eroded German strength. In February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked a turning point not only militarily but psychologically. The myth of German invincibility was shattered once more, and the momentum on the Eastern Front shifted decisively toward the Soviet Union. Across the globe, the war intensified, nations now fully committed to a struggle that would test the limits of endurance, resources, and resolve. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Solomon Islands, from the icy steppes of Russia to the storm-tossed Atlantic, the conflict pressed forward, reshaping cultures, economies, and the very nature of modern warfare. The stage was set for the next major shifts, battles that would stretch across continents as the Allies sought not just survival, but the gradual, grinding reclamation of territory from the Axis powers. In the wake of Stalingrad, the war entered a new phase, one defined not by rapid conquests but by grinding, relentless campaigns that stretched the capacities of every nation involved. Nowhere was this more evident than in North Africa, where desert winds swept across the dunes, carrying with them the dust of tanks, trucks, and marching infantry. For years, North Africa had been a theater of shifting fortunes. Italian ambitions had faltered early, prompting Germany to send the Afrika Korps under the command of General Erwin Rommel, whose daring maneuvers earned him a reputation as the Desert Fox. His forces, agile and skilled, had pushed the British back and forth across Libya and into Egypt in a series of sweeping offensives. Yet by 1942, the strategic balance had begun to change. The British Eighth Army, reorganized and bolstered by new American-built armor, stood ready under the leadership of General Bernard Montgomery. In October, at El Alamein, Montgomery launched a massive offensive that would become one of the most decisive battles in the Desert War. Artillery thundered across the night sky, lighting the sands with flashes of fire. The fighting was intense, the terrain unforgiving, but gradually the Axis line began to crumble. Supply shortages, air superiority held by the Allies, and the sheer weight of material advantage forced Rommel into retreat. Churchill would later remark that before El Alamein, the Allies had never known victory. After it, they would never again know defeat. As Rommel's forces withdrew across Libya, another blow struck the Axis presence in North Africa. In November 1942, Allied troops landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, the first major American-led offensive of the war. The landings, coordinated with British forces, caught Vichy French defenders in a complex political and military dilemma. Resistance was sporadic but ultimately gave way, allowing the Allies to advance eastward and link up with Montgomery's army. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa, surrounded, outnumbered, and running desperately short of supplies, surrendered en masse. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner, opening the door to Allied operations in southern Europe. While victory in North Africa offered a critical strategic foothold, events on the Eastern Front surged toward another colossal confrontation. The German army, reeling from the defeat at Stalingrad, sought to regain the initiative. During the winter and spring of 1943, the Wehrmacht regrouped and reinforced its lines, preparing for a major counteroffensive aimed at eliminating a massive Soviet-held bulge around the city of Kursk. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, called for 2 German pincers to encircle Soviet forces in a massive double envelopment. It was a bold design, reminiscent of earlier successes, but the circumstances had changed. Soviet intelligence, bolstered by reconnaissance and code-breaking, learned of German intentions months in advance. Instead of being caught off guard, the Red Army prepared extensively, constructing deep defensive networks layered with trenches, minefields, anti-tank barriers, and artillery placements. When the German assault began in July 1943, it collided with this prepared fortress. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank engagement in history, a clash of armor on a scale that defied imagination. Waves of German Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs rolled forward, confronted by Soviet T-34s and swarms of anti-tank guns. The fighting was brutal and costly. At Prokhorovka, thousands of tanks surged across open fields in a chaotic, thunderous melee. Dust and smoke filled the air, steel ground against steel, shells streaked across the plains. Despite initial German gains, their progress slowed, then halted entirely. Soviet reserves, larger than the Germans had anticipated, launched counterattacks along the front. By mid-July, Hitler called off the operation. Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, after which the Red Army seized the strategic initiative permanently. Across the Mediterranean, the Allies capitalized on their momentum. In July 1943, they launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Amphibious landings and airborne drops marked the beginning of a campaign that would dislodge Axis forces from the island and open the path to mainland Italy. The fierce but brief battle for Sicily revealed cracks in the Axis alliance. Italian morale, weakened by years of setbacks, deteriorated further as the Allies advanced. By September, the Italian government overthrew Benito Mussolini and sought an armistice. Germany moved swiftly to occupy northern and central Italy, disarm Italian units, and rescue Mussolini to lead a puppet state. What followed was a brutal series of battles as German forces, now entrenched along a series of fortified lines across the mountainous Italian peninsula, resisted the Allied push northward. The fighting at Salerno, Monte Cassino, and Anzio became grinding, costly endeavors. Italy would not be fully liberated until the final months of the war. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the tides continued to shift. The American victory at Midway had halted Japan's expansion, but the struggle to reclaim territory across the vast ocean had only begun. The Allied campaign adopted a new strategy, island hopping. Rather than assault every Japanese-held island, commanders selected key positions to capture while bypassing others, leaving them isolated and starved of supplies. The first major test came on Guadalcanal, where the battle turned into a 6-month slog of jungle fighting, naval engagements, and aerial duels. Marines and soldiers endured relentless attacks, disease, and shortages, while Japanese troops, equally determined, launched repeated assaults to retake the island. By February 1943, the Allies secured Guadalcanal, marking Japan's first major land defeat and signaling a shift in momentum. From there, the campaign expanded across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Battles at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Peleliu tested American forces in brutal conditions. Japanese defenders dug into caves, tunnels, and fortified positions, determined to resist to the last man. Casualties mounted on both sides, but American industrial production ensured a steady flow of ships, aircraft, and trained personnel. Each island seized brought the Allies closer to Japan's home territory and within range of strategic bombing campaigns. Yet even as these global battles unfolded, deeper currents of technology, intelligence, and industrial power shaped the war's trajectory. In Britain, the work of codebreakers at Bletchley Park, led by figures like Alan Turing, yielded breakthroughs that allowed Allied commanders to read portions of German communications encrypted by the Enigma machine. These insights helped tilt the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favor and provided critical information before major operations. Radar, sonar, proximity fuses, improved aircraft designs, and advances in logistics all intertwined to transform warfare into a complex interplay of firepower, strategy, and information. On the home front across Allied nations, vast shifts unfolded. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, taking roles once reserved for men. Civilian populations endured rationing, blackouts, and the constant fear of attack. Propaganda campaigns encouraged unity and sacrifice. In Germany, Allied bombing raids increased in intensity, targeting industrial centers, transportation networks, and urban infrastructure. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne endured firestorms that scorched entire districts, leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. In Japan, American submarines choked shipping lanes, cutting off vital resources and tightening the noose around its island empire. By late 1943, the turning of the tide was unmistakable. The Axis powers, once riding a wave of early triumphs, now struggled under the relentless pressure of multiple fronts. The Allies, bolstered by growing strength and improved coordination, prepared for the next decisive stage, a return to Western Europe, where the outcome of the war would ultimately be determined. Ahead lay one of the most complex and ambitious operations in military history, one that would require unprecedented cooperation among nations and would place hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the shores of a continent under occupation. The liberation of Europe was approaching, and with it, the beginning of the final, grueling phase of the global conflict. Across the scattered islands of the Central Pacific, American commanders confronted a grim calculus that would come to define the next phase of the war. Every mile gained toward Japan meant higher casualties, steeper defenses, and an enemy increasingly resolved to fight to the last. The lessons of Tarawa had been seared into the Marine Corps, the need for better intelligence, tougher landing craft, more coordinated naval gunfire. Yet even with these improvements, the path ahead remained brutally uncertain. And as U.S. forces prepared to seize the Marshall Islands, they did so knowing that the Japanese garrisons were entrenched, experienced, and psychologically conditioned for annihilation before surrender. When the U.S. Navy advanced toward Kwajalein and Eniwetok in early 1944, it brought with it an expanding armada: carriers, fast battleships, submarines, transports, amphibious tractors, and thousands of aircraft. The Pacific War was becoming a contest of industrial output as much as strategy, and the United States, armed with mass production and a population far from the reach of Axis bombing, was rapidly outpacing Japan in ships, aircraft, and fuel. But numbers alone could not predict victory. Each battle would test coordination, morale, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy. On Kwajalein Atoll, American Marines and soldiers fought in a latticework of coral, bunkers, and fortified trenches. Japanese defenders, cut off from supply and reinforcement, clung to every firing position with despairing tenacity. The bombardment that preceded the landings was among the most intense of the war, stripping away the shallow palm groves and exposing ruined blockhouses. Yet an eerie silence often greeted the first assault waves, because many defenders had retreated into tunnels or hardened shelters designed to outlast naval fire, emerging only when U.S. troops approached within yards. Again and again, the fighting collapsed into close-quarters duels, where grenades, flamethrowers, and demolitions played a decisive and horrifying role. By mid-February 1944, the Marshals had fallen, and the thrust toward the Marianas began to take shape. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces positioned themselves to strike directly at Japan's inner defensive ring. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were more than mere stepping stones. They were airfields waiting to be built, points from which the new B-29 superfortress could launch heavy incendiary raids on the Japanese home islands. Their capture would bring U.S. firepower within reach of Tokyo itself, and because of that, the Imperial High Command vowed that these islands must not fall, no matter the cost. Yet even as the Pacific storms of coral and fire swept westward, a very different transformation was reshaping the European theater. In Italy, the grinding battles along the Gustav Line and the hellish slopes of Monte Cassino tested Allied infantry to the limit. The terrain itself became an adversary, funneling attacks into narrow valleys overlooked by German artillery. The ancient abbey on the mountain's summit stood as both a symbol and a vantage point. Although it was initially unoccupied by German troops, its presence dominated the landscape, and Allied commanders eventually authorized its bombardment, a decision that reduced centuries of history to rubble and, ironically, created better defensive positions for the German paratroopers who soon occupied the ruins. As the Italian campaign dragged on, the difficulties of coordination among multinational forces became increasingly clear. British, American, French, Polish, Indian, and other Allied units all fought in rugged terrain under unforgiving conditions. Driving rain, muddy slopes, freezing nights, and valleys that turned into killing zones under German machine gun fire. Soldiers from distant homelands found themselves locked in battles where progress was measured in yards, not miles. The capture of Rome in June 1944 would bring relief and political symbolism, but it was overshadowed almost immediately by the much larger offensive unfolding across the English Channel. For even as troops battled their way up the Italian peninsula, an immense logistical and strategic project was nearing completion in southern England. The invasion of Nazi-occupied France, long discussed, endlessly debated, meticulously planned, was finally approaching. The scale of the undertaking defied imagination. Over 2 million Allied troops positioned across Britain, countless vehicles hidden in forests and barns, airfields packed with bombers and gliders, temporary harbors engineered on drawing boards, and a deception campaign so elaborate that even many senior officers were unaware of its full scope. Codenamed Operation Overlord, it would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The Luftwaffe, weakened by attrition and fuel shortages, could no longer contest the skies over England effectively, granting the Allies a decisive advantage. Yet the German defenses along the Channel coast, the Atlantic Wall, were formidable. Miles of barbed wire, concrete bunkers bristling with artillery, tank traps, minefields, and interlocking machine gun nests designed to slaughter any invader before they reached open ground. For months, Allied bombers and reconnaissance missions mapped, probed, and attacked these positions, seeking weaknesses and refining the landing plans that would soon define the fate of Europe. But to storm the continent successfully, the Allies needed more than firepower. They needed German commanders to be confused about where and when the invasion would occur. Thus began one of the most intricate deception operations in military history. Fake armies made of inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft appeared in fields. Radio traffic simulated the movements of divisions that did not exist. And perhaps most famously, the Allies fed misinformation through double agents, convincing the German High Command that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the Channel's narrowest point, rather than the beaches of Normandy. Even after the landings began, this deception would hold, causing Hitler and his generals to withhold critical reserves at the decisive moment. While these grand preparations unfolded, life for civilians across occupied Europe remained precarious. marked by curfews, rationing, intimidation, and the ceaseless threat of reprisals. Resistance movements in France, the Low Countries, and Norway gathered intelligence, sabotaged transport networks, and passed on crucial reports that shaped Allied planning. Each act of defiance carried the risk of torture or execution, yet ordinary citizens, railway workers, farmers, students, chose to fight in whatever ways they could. Their courage formed the unseen scaffolding upon which the invasion would rely. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet juggernaut was gathering momentum for another series of offensives. The brutal winter battles along the Eastern Front had drained both armies, but the Red Army, now better armed and increasingly confident, prepared to smash through the weakened German lines in Ukraine and Belarus. Soviet commanders understood that the long-awaited Allied landings in France would constrain Germany's ability to shift reinforcements eastward, and they planned to strike in concert. What emerged was an unspoken, synchronized pressure. The Western Allies driving toward Normandy and the Soviet Union preparing for a colossal assault codenamed Operation Bagration, which would, later that summer, obliterate Army Group Center and tear open the Eastern Front on a scale unmatched even by Stalingrad. Across continents, across oceans, the war was tightening simultaneously on all fronts, compressing the Axis powers in a vice of attrition and overwhelming logistics. But the final outcome still hung in the balance. Soldiers in foxholes, sailors on night watch, aircrews flying perilous missions deep into enemy territory, all felt the weight of expectation and the burden of uncertainty. The next moves would shape not only military fortunes, but the fate of nations and millions of lives. As the spring of 1944 turned to summer, the Allied coalition, with all its complexities and tensions, prepared to unleash the decisive blow in Western Europe. Young men across England wrote last letters home, medics sorted bandages, chaplains walked among the tents offering quiet words of comfort, and on the decks of transport ships, infantry units rehearsed the steps they would take after the landing ramps dropped. In hushed briefings, they studied sand tables and photographs of beaches with code names that would soon be carved into the memory of the world: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. And as dawn approached on the 6th day of June, the invasion force assembled silently in the Channel, a vast constellation of ships stretching to the horizon, each one carrying human stories of courage, fear, and irrevocable destiny. The armada moved through the darkness beneath a low, heavy sky. Wind swept across the decks as destroyers and transports cut through the waters of the Channel, guided by radar, compasses, and the steady glow of signal lamps. Above them, transport aircraft droned eastward, carrying airborne divisions whose fate depended entirely on surprise, coordination, and the hope that the winds would not scatter them too widely across the Norman countryside. Every man aboard knew that the hours ahead would transform the trajectory of the war, either opening the gateway to Europe's liberation or ending in catastrophe. The airborne assault began long before the first landing craft approached the beaches. Paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions leapt into the night over the Cotentin Peninsula, tasked with seizing causeways, disrupting German communications, and preventing counterattacks against Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers, along with glider-borne units, descended near the Orne River and the vital bridges that controlled access to the eastern flank of the invasion. Their landings were chaotic, marked by drifting drop zones and confused navigation, yet the scattered groups improvised with remarkable determination. Small clusters of paratroopers fought independent battles, capturing crossroads, silencing gun positions, and sowing disruption across an area that was supposed to be quiet. In fields marked by hedgerows and orchards, they clashed with German units still reeling from the suddenness of the attack. As first light broke, the main invasion force drew within sight of the Normandy coast. The steady rumble of naval bombardment shook the decks as cruisers and battleships opened fire on German fortifications. The beaches seemed deceptively still from afar, lines of dunes, empty stretches of sand, patches of coastal villages, but beneath that calm lay a labyrinth of defenses honed by years of German preparation. Concrete bunkers sat angled toward the sea, fields of mines lay buried just beneath the sand, and machine gun nests commanded the tidal flats. The Atlantic Wall, though incomplete in places, was deadly where it counted. At beaches like Utah and Gold, currents and mislandings shifted the first assault waves, but in a twist of fate, those errors often placed the troops in slightly less fortified sectors, allowing them to push inland with fewer losses. On Juneau and Sword, British and Canadian forces fought through surf and gunfire, battling to gain footholds beside seaside towns and choked lanes lined with stone walls. But at Omaha Beach, where the American 1st and 29th Divisions landed, almost everything seemed to go wrong. The rough seas scattered the landing craft, the smoke and bombardment failed to neutralize the strongest defenses, and infantry were forced to wade hundreds of yards under blistering fire. Soldiers clung to shattered obstacles or pressed themselves into the sand as bullets swept the beach. Leadership at the small unit level, officers and sergeants rallying men behind shingle banks and bluffs, became the decisive factor in preventing a complete collapse. By midday, through grit, improvisation, and relentless pressure, the landing succeeded, though at heartbreaking cost. Behind the beaches, armored units rolled ashore, engineers cleared mines, medics triaged the wounded, and supply officers arranged the stream of materiel necessary to sustain the advance. The first 24 hours were a test not only of courage but of logistics, the unglamorous yet indispensable machinery of war. Engineers constructed artificial harbors from massive prefabricated sections towed across the channel, the mulberries, which allowed thousands of tons of supplies to come ashore each day. Fuel pipelines were laid beneath the sea. Airfields sprang up in fields that days earlier had been calm farmland. The Allied invasion had become an immense organism, breathing, feeding, expanding across the French countryside. The Germans, still unsure whether Normandy was the main landing or a diversion from an expected attack at Pas-de-Calais, hesitated to unleash their full armored reserves. When they did respond, it was with formidable units, panzer divisions hardened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front. But Allied air superiority, which had been painstakingly achieved over the previous months, now proved decisive. Fighter bombers streaked across the sky, strafing columns, destroying bridges, and harassing enemy reinforcements. The battlefield became a crucible where mobility, timing, and intelligence shaped the momentum as much as direct combat. In the bocage, Normandy's dense patchwork of hedgerows, progress slowed to a brutal crawl. Each field became a miniature fortress, each hedgerow a deadly barrier concealing machine guns and anti-tank teams. Infantry units adapted, using explosives to breach the earthen walls and developing new tactics in the midst of daily combat. Tanks were modified with iron prongs, rhino tanks, to smash through the hedgerows rather than expose themselves to predictable ambushes. These innovations, born of necessity and paid for with lives, gradually built the means for a breakout. To the east, in the Soviet Union, the long-awaited offensive erupted. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, devastated the German Army Group Center with a fury unmatched since the start of the war. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. Cities long held by the Wehrmacht, Vitebsk, Mogilev, Minsk, fell in rapid succession. In mere weeks, the front line shifted hundreds of miles west. Germany's strategic position collapsed beneath simultaneous pressure, the Western Allies carving a foothold in France, and the Red Army smashing through its most critical defensive line in the east. As Soviet forces surged toward Poland and the Baltic states, the Germans scrambled to stabilize their defenses. Yet the speed of the advance shattered their rail networks and communications, leaving commanders increasingly isolated and unable to coordinate counterattacks. The Eastern Front had become a storm of movement, a vast, shifting struggle of armor, infantry, and air power hurtling across plains and forests. Civilians trapped in the path of these offensives endured unimaginable suffering, caught between retreating occupiers and advancing armies. Many fled with little more than what they could carry. Back in France, as July 1944 wore on, the Allies finally achieved the breakthrough they had fought so hard to secure. A massive bombardment shattered the German defenses near Saint-Lô, and American armored divisions poured through the breach in Operation Cobra. What followed was a sweeping advance across Brittany and into the heart of France. German units, exhausted and increasingly isolated, faced encirclement near Falaise, where some of the most intense fighting of the summer unfolded. In a narrow corridor crowded with fleeing vehicles, artillery and infantry, Allied air power and artillery inflicted devastating losses. The closing of the Falaise pocket marked the collapse of the German position in northern France. As Paris rose in open revolt, the Allies advanced rapidly toward the city. For 4 years its streets had suffered under occupation. Now barricades appeared, the French resistance surged into action, and gunfire echoed down boulevards once marked by silence. When Allied troops entered the capital in late August, they found a city weary yet unbroken, a moment of jubilation that stood in stark contrast to the grinding battles that still raged across the continent. By the autumn of 1944, with France liberated and Germany retreating on all sides, the end of the war seemed finally within reach. Yet the coming months would reveal that desperation could be as deadly as strength. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht was preparing one last, massive gamble, a counteroffensive designed to tear open the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But before the snows fell and the lines erupted again, the world had entered a fragile moment of transition. The Allies were learning that victory, though closer than ever, would demand sacrifices still unimaginable. And far across the world, in the Pacific, American forces were closing in on islands where the fighting would reach new and terrible extremes. Beginning with the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, and later the blood-soaked ridges of Okinawa, where the ferocity of resistance would redefine the cost of bringing the war to an end. Across the Pacific, as 1945 approached, the momentum of war pushed relentlessly toward the Japanese home islands. The capture of the Marianas had provided the United States with the airfields necessary for strategic bombing, and soon B-29 superfortresses began crossing thousands of miles of open ocean, striking industrial centers that had once seemed unreachable. Japan, increasingly isolated, rationed fuel, salvaged aircraft parts from wrecks, and trained young pilots for missions that offered little chance of return. The skies over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka grew thick with smoke as the bombers unleashed unprecedented incendiary raids, turning entire districts into burning plains of destruction. The scale of devastation shocked even seasoned commanders, yet the Japanese government showed no sign of capitulation. To gain the bases needed for a potential invasion of Japan, American forces targeted Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. Its location allowed Japanese fighters to intercept American bombers and offered airfields from which crippled U.S. aircraft might seek refuge. The island's defenders, under General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, prepared an elaborate system of bunkers, tunnels, and fortifications carved into volcanic rock. Unlike earlier battles, Kurabayashi forbade futile banzai charges, choosing instead a strategy of attrition. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they stepped onto beaches of black sand beneath the looming shadow of Mount Suribachi, unaware of how deeply entrenched the defenders were. The battle became one of the most intense struggles of the Pacific War. Every yard required demolitions, flamethrowers, and close-quarters combat. Smoke, ash, and the stench of sulfur filled the air. The raising of the American flag atop Suribachi became an enduring symbol, yet the fighting continued for weeks, costing tens of thousands of lives. By the time the island was secured, its strategic value became undeniable. Thousands of damaged B-29s would eventually make emergency landings there, saving countless airmen who otherwise would have been lost at sea. But the path to Japan still demanded another, far bloodier ordeal. Okinawa, the largest island seized during the war, lay just 350 miles from Kyushu. Its capture was indispensable for establishing staging grounds, supply depots, and airfields for any invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese, fully aware of its significance, poured forces into the island and prepared a defense in depth, using the rough terrain, cave networks, and fortified ridges to maximum effect. From April to June 1945, the island became a vortex of misery. Artillery thundered day and night, rainstorms turned trenches into rivers of mud, civilians, trapped between advancing armies, suffered on a scale impossible to quantify. Kamikaze attacks overwhelmed the U.S. fleet offshore, sinking or damaging dozens of ships. When the battle finally ended, Okinawa lay shattered, its hills cratered, its villages burned, its people traumatized by months of relentless violence. In Europe, meanwhile, the winter of 1944-45 brought the final, desperate gamble of the German war effort. In the Ardennes, under cover of fog and snow, Hitler launched a massive counteroffensive aimed at splitting the Allied lines and capturing the port of Antwerp. American units scattered across the forests were thrust into a maelstrom of armor and infantry, fighting in freezing conditions with limited supplies. The siege of Bastogne, where surrounded American paratroopers held firm against overwhelming odds, became one of the defining episodes of the war's final months. When the weather cleared, Allied aircraft returned to the skies, striking at German tanks and supply lines. The offensive collapsed, and the last reserves of the Wehrmacht were spent. The Battle of the Bulge marked not only Germany's final offensive in the West, but the exhaustion of its ability to wage modern war. As spring approached, the Allies surged into Germany from all directions. To the east, the Soviet Union launched its final drives toward Berlin, tearing through East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia with overwhelming firepower. Cities caught in the path of the front endured bombardment, street fighting, and the collapse of civil authority. Refugees streamed westward in freezing weather, seeking safety from the chaos engulfing the eastern provinces. The Red Army, hardened by 4 years of brutal conflict, pressed on with relentless determination, closing in on the German capital. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine after seizing the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a stroke of fortune that accelerated the collapse of German defenses. Armored divisions swept into the heartland, liberating towns and uncovering the grim remnants of the regime's atrocities. As concentration camps were overrun, the world confronted the horrifying scale of the Holocaust: skeletal survivors, mass graves, and facilities designed with chilling precision for extermination. The revelations shocked even battle-hardened soldiers and reshaped global understanding of the Nazi regime's crimes. Berlin itself became a battlefield of rubble, smoke, and close combat. Soviet units fought block by block, pushing toward the Reichstag as artillery reduced entire districts to ruins. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, issued orders detached from reality while the city collapsed above him. In late April, recognizing that defeat was inevitable, he took his own life. The remaining German commanders began negotiating surrenders, though pockets of resistance continued. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. The fighting had ended, but the war had reshaped the continent in ways that would echo through decades. Yet even as celebrations erupted across Europe, the war in the Pacific continued with undiminished ferocity. The invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, loomed as a terrifying prospect. Military planners predicted casualties on a scale surpassing any previous campaign. Japanese defenses were formidable: millions of soldiers, fortified positions, and a civilian population that had been mobilized for resistance. The home islands braced for a final battle, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Then in August 1945, everything changed in an instant. The United States used a weapon whose destructive power defied comprehension. On August 6, a single atomic bomb detonated above Hiroshima, obliterating vast portions of the city and killing tens of thousands in seconds. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The scale of devastation, shockwaves, radiation, firestorms, introduced humanity to a new and terrifying era. Faced with overwhelming destruction, the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, and the impossibility of further resistance, the Japanese government announced its surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the signing of the formal documents ended the most devastating conflict in human history. World War II left behind a world transformed. Entire nations lay in ruins, borders shifted, empires collapsed, millions of families mourned lives lost. Yet from the ashes emerged institutions and alliances aimed at preventing such destruction from ever happening again. The United Nations was founded, colonial systems began to crumble, and a new geopolitical order took shape, marked by rivalry, reconstruction, and the dawning Cold War. The sacrifices of soldiers and civilians, the courage of resistance movements, the horrors revealed in camps and battlefields alike, all became part of a collective memory defined not only by violence, but by resilience. The story of World War II remains a testament to the extremes of human capacity, for cruelty and for sacrifice, for destruction and for endurance. It is a story written in the ruins of cities, in the silence of cemeteries, and in the fragile peace that followed. And though the war ended decades ago, its echoes still shape the world, reminding us of the cost of tyranny, the power of unity, and the enduring responsibility to safeguard the fragile peace earned by so many who never returned home.